I hereby announce my retirement from Formula One by the end of the 2022 season. Probably I should start with a long list of people to thank now, but I feel it is more important to explain the reasons behind my decision. I love this sport. It has been central to my life since I can remember. But as much as there's life on track, there's my life off track too. I look forward to race down unknown tracks, and I will be finding new challenges. The marks I left on track will stay until time and rain will wash them away. New ones will be put down. Tomorrow belongs to those shaping today. Farewell, and thanks for letting me share the track with you. I loved every bit of it.
This is where it all began for Sebastian Vettel. The 1980s dying out, living in West Germany from humble beginnings, but he was obviously a kid with big dreams. I don't know if the world of Formula One was rushing through his head when he first drove a go-kart at the age of 3, but it obviously piqued his interest enough to race competitively at the age of 8 come 1995, the year Germany's his hero, Michael Schumacher, became a 2-time Formula One world champion. Schumi was the first German Formula One champion, and many a young'un in Deutschland were wondering if they could be the next. Sure, there had been other prodigies that came along in that time. Nick Heidfeld, Heinz-Harald Frentzen, even Michael's box-headed brother Ralph. But even when Dr. Helmut Marko signed Vettel to his development team for 1998, I'm not sure that this was a sign that he was meant to become the next German icon. Until 2002, however, he continued to race on the karting scene, winning trophy after trophy to such an extent that one had to take notice that maybe, while this dude couldn't sing or jump, he could steer a go-kart. Could he steer a racing car though? Back in 2003, there were only really 2 good options for any young German trying to break into the motor racing scene. The first, and perhaps the more sensible one, quit the sport and spend the money on better options like an education or traveling the world, curing world hunger, paying back Nicolas Cage's debt, anything but this, or as Seb so chose, compete in the German Formula BMW series. This of course back in a time where Formula 4 did not exist and the FIA had less of a rudder than they do now. Seb was signed up with Eifelland Racing alongside Andreas Wirth. Wirth was alright, won a championship here and there, and he already had a full season's worth of Formula BMW experience under his belt, so as long as Seb can stay in touch with him in the championship, then it will be good enough for a first attempt. Well, he didn't stay within touch of him. He destroyed him. Wirth finished the year in 10th place, only collecting 1 podium, although ironically scoring the same points as he did last year. Vettel, however, well, he scored 5 wins that season, 12 podiums, 5 pole positions, and finished 2nd in the championship. You would imagine Marko would be pleased with Sebastian's performance, and he was, but I wouldn't have thought he'd be so impressed that he would put him into a champ car at season's end for a secret 2-day test at Homestead, Miami. To reiterate here, a young driver in his first year of car racing, greener than goose is thrust into a champ car, which at that time had enough power to overthrow a South American dictatorship. He did impress, but the champ car route didn't eventuate to anything, because for 2004 he went back to Europe, once again competing in German Formula BMW. Now with Peter Mucker's team, a title win was the aim. But that wasn't enough for Seb. He annihilated them all. There were 20 races that year. He won 18 of them, and the 2 races he didn't win, he was on the podium anyway. The gap in the championship was vast.
Stop! He's already dead.
This was just such a comprehensive walkover victory. The competition just had no chance. Only thing I can liken it to is Surfshark VPN, because truthfully, no one comes close. Yeah, I had to pull that shit. If y'all don't know what Surfshark is, it's a VPN service that encrypts all the data that you send through the internet, protecting said data and keeping any minuses from getting at it. Surfshark ain't a one-trick pony though. We're not talking about Gunther Steiner here. Like, we all love streaming, right? We also hate it whenever streaming services are restricted based on our country, right? Well, with Surfshark, you can change your location, bypass said restrictions, and thereby allow access to your favorite shows or your favorite content. You know, like yours truly. It can also be a vital tool for those who live in countries that heavily censor their people for some freaking reason. It ain't quite teleportation, but it is about as close as we're gonna get right now. So for this month, by using my link in the description and using the promo code Josh Ravel, you can get Surfshark VPN for 85% off and 3 extra months for free. That amounts to around about a couple of bucks a month for protection only otherwise offered by the Mexican Minister of Defense. Although unlike that scenario, this one doesn't exceed the budget cap.
Just a joke. Stay calm.
Plus there's 3 free months on there and a 30-day money-back guarantee as well. So what the bloody hell are you waiting for? At this point, however, it was time to move on. I'm talking about Sebastian Vettel, of course. Having demolished Formula BMW, it was onwards and upwards to Formula 3, the logical progression. He was staying at Muka Motorsport for 2005 and, ironically, with the same teammate in Attila Abreu. Abreu was by no means a slow driver, but Seb did have his number. Although Seb himself would not win a race that season, he did acquire a nice array of podiums and he did finish the year 5th in the standings. But the Formula 3 Euro Series that year was utterly dominated by the ASM racing outfit, which that year was led by a man who would become a real thorn in his side for a great many years to come, the one and only Lewis Hamilton. But with P5 in the standings, Seb did win the Rookies title, and in the Macau Grand Prix later that year, he got onto the podium. What was perhaps more interesting about that race, Seb was driving for ASM, Lewis's team that year. All preparation for the 2006 season, where he would be driving for that team wholesale. He grabbed 4 wins in the 2006 season and was right in the hunt for the title. But he wouldn't win it. A string of bad results in the latter half of the year meant that he would end up losing the title to the man who was supposedly the most biased pundit in the world and the most jealous man on the planet, the pride of Scotland, Paul de Resta. By the way, if you can't detect the sarcasm there, I don't know what to tell you. If one were to be totally honest, that year for Seb was a bit of a letdown. Not great results in the Masters of F3 or Macau Grand Prix, and then to miss out on the European Championship. After all that promise, all he had to show for it was a runner-up placing to the Flying Scotsman. There were a couple of silver linings, however. Midway through 2006, BMW Sauber had finally had enough of Jacques Villeneuve's bullshit, or his music. Same thing, but anyway. As a result, they ditched him for Robert Kubica, and thus created an opening in the third driver role in that team. Who do you think they drafted in? Damn, how'd you guess that? At the 2006 Turkish Grand Prix, he became the youngest driver to compete in a Grand Prix weekend at 19 years and 53 days, a record he could be proud of. One he wasn't too proud of was being penalised for speeding in the pit lane. 9 seconds into his Formula 1 career, he nevertheless impressed in his time there. That wasn't the only place he impressed. Over in the World Series by Renault series, Red Bull plunked him into Trevor Carlin's car for 2 rounds in Misano and Spa. His performances were good, very good, and seeing as how the World Series by Renault hadn't collapsed yet, he was thrust into that series for 2007, driving alongside Michael Aloshin. He wasn't bound to have the easiest of times, not the hardest either, but Aloshin had driven for the team the previous year and would eventually become a series champion, and he proved his competency by taking pole position and the win in the opening race. But he would never finish ahead of Seb again. Seb demonstrated remarkable consistency, and by the end of the 3rd round in Monaco, he was leading the standings. It seemed he was a shoo-in for the title, but he would never compete past the 4th round, and that wasn't because of underperformance or Red Bull dropping him or anything like that. It was thanks to circumstances beyond his control. His world was about to change forever. Robert Kubica's crash took the pole out of commission for a while, and BMW Sauber needed a replacement. Naturally, with Seb being effectively their 3rd driver, they brought him in for the United States Grand Prix, giving this young whippersnapper his Formula 1 debut. He wasn't exactly expected to beat his teammate Nick Heidfeld. I mean, after all, they don't call him Quick Nick for nothing. And sure enough, Seb couldn't out-qualify him, but he did qualify in 7th place, which was a commendable effort, and he would finish in P8 to score a point, the youngest driver ever to get one in Formula 1 up to that point. But by the next round, Kubica was back to full health, and Seb's services were no longer required. He went back to the World Series and continued to press on with his title hunt. But then he was interrupted again when the European Grand Prix had destroyed any amount of patience anyone ever had for Scott Speed. Whatever story you want to believe, the reality was that when Speed left the paddock, he would not return. That was his Formula 1 career over. Toro Rosso needed a new driver, and Marco knew exactly who he wanted to feed to Franz Tost. BMW Sauber allowed Seb to leave the family and head to Faenza. At the 2007 Hungarian Grand Prix, Seb's full-time assault in Formula 1 would begin. Quite badly, getting knocked out in Q1, being outqualified by his teammate Tonio Liozzi, and finished a lap behind the pack. Not that Liozzi would have been feeling great, because he was informed that he wouldn't be around come 2008, that he would be replaced by Sebastian Vettel for that year, and that Vettel would be keeping his seat. Seb therefore had job security in his arsenal, and you would be amazed at how well that works, nurturing a driver instead of the typical Marco mindset of drive faster or die. Liozzi was a damn fast driver, but Seb was starting to rein him in on track, and in the Japanese Grand Prix, he would put his Toro Toro Rosso inside the top 10, a remarkable performance, and in the race, he had climbed up to third. In any circumstance, in a Toro Rosso was freaking amazing. Not that you could really see him through the deluge of spray, Seb couldn't even see himself, or the Red Bull of Mark Webber directly in front of him. He ploughed into the back of him, the collision having torn most of the suspension off, which, believe it or not, is somewhat detrimental toward the handling of a car. They both retired from the race and out of a podium position, and the butt-chinned Hugh Jackman clone had a few things to say about it.
Those kids, isn't it? Kids with not enough experience doing a good job and they f it all up.
I don't think he was very happy. Then again, this was back in a time where Red Bull were not all that great, so to be knocked out of a podium position when they didn't see very many of those back then would have been a kick in the teeth. Luckily for Seb, Toss didn't take that into a literal sense, but he would redeem himself in Shanghai, where he drove to a splendid 4th place, after starting from 17th on the grid. It set himself up for 2008, with people around him prophesizing the arrival of a truly special talent. But when it all kicked off in Melbourne for the first round of 08, he was bulldozed at the first corner and out of the race. In Malaysia, his hydraulics went on strike. In Bahrain, he was bulldozed again on the first lap, and in Spain, he was once again taken out on the first lap by the maniacal Force Indias. He would not score points until Monaco, finishing in P5 after starting from the back row of the grid. Actually, say that again. Scoring points. 5th place specifically, after starting from the back in Monaco. That's special. It was also around this time when Toro Rosso debuted their new chassis during the middle of the year. While it didn't matter too much in the grand scheme of things considering he always kicked his teammates' ass, his performances were being noticed. Bear in mind that just 3 years earlier, this team was Minardi, and for however much we loved Minardi, they could not find speed for the life of them if they were trapped in Trevor Phillips' kitchen. Seb was somehow making it work, and then when the F1 circus arrived in Valencia for the European Grand Prix, something clicked for him. He qualified P6 on the grid and had actually topped the Q2 session, ahead of the Ferraris and the McLarens. There was a sense that a magic result was not too far away. They prayed for rain and God gave them a flood. Literally. The Italian Grand Prix brought about a massively wet occasion, which does sometimes spring a surprise result, but when the dust settled at the end of qualifying, no one could quite believe who was on pole position. In this, Sebastian Vettel became the youngest pole position winner in Formula 1 history. Sure, the Toro Rosso was working well in these conditions, but he did top every one of them after all. But surely, this was just a one-off, like we've seen before in the past. Tomorrow would bring about order and reason. I mean, it has to. Come race day, it was still raining, and the race started behind the safety car. Seb bolted into the lead, while everyone around him played a game of chicken heading into turn 1. Championship contenders were siding through the pack, but they would only get so far. The track not drying quite enough for slick tyres. Seb was in complete control, only losing the lead when he came in to complete a pit stop. At the end of lap 53, however, he was still leading the race, and the checkered flag had fallen to greet the now youngest ever winner of a Grand Prix. And it all began here, in a Toro Rosso, in a rainy parkland outside of Milan. Everyone knew just how special it was, with people even comparing him to Michael Schumacher. And really, when you note the similarities surrounding their careers, you can understand why people were calling him Baby Schumi. They were loving this kid. He was the talk of the paddock. But at the final round at Interlagos, he was about to become a real headache for some people. The Brazilian Grand Prix brought about at the final round of the 2008 season, and the showdown between the hometown boy Felipe Massa and the future hometown boy Lewis Hamilton for the World Drivers' Championship. Lewis seemed to have a relatively easy look in for the title. I mean, all he needed to do was to finish 5th or better, and the McLaren was definitely good enough for it that year. But something was about to give this Lewis-McLaren combo a very hard time indeed. And yeah, you guessed it. It was rain. Massa went pretty much unchallenged throughout that race, which was all he could really do. Lewis though did need to finish in P5, which even when the rain was to come, is easy enough for the McLaren. I mean, it was one of the best cars that year, and Lewis himself is one of the best when it comes to driving on water. Then again, the sight of Sebastian Vettel's Toro Rosso ranging up behind him whilst Lewis was sitting in 5th place was not in the script that they had for that weekend. Who is this guy and who does he think he is challenging the McLaren in his rebranded Minardi? Get out of here, don't you interfere with us. With a few laps to go though, the rain was really starting to come up on the circuit. Going through Junsao, Hamilton ran wide. and Vettel went on through to take 5th position, and he would stay ahead of Lewis's McLaren, finishing in 4th place in his Toro Rosso. Wouldn't be the last time either that he would interfere with Lewis Hamilton's championship plans. After drowning at the start of the year with 89 million retirements, Seb went on a barnstorming run in the latter half of the year, posting results that no one would dare imagine before. Not just points, good points, straight up Grand Prix wins. And of course, that win helped him finish ahead of both Red Bulls in the championship and helped propel Toro Rosso ahead of the quote-unquote main team in the Constructors' Championship. But when David Coulthard announced his retirement earlier that year, it left a vacancy at Red Bull for 2009, and Seb wasn't going to turn that down. Funnily enough, he'd actually got the call-up in July that year. The manic uplift in form, however, must have left Christian Horner and Helmut Marko clutching at their tinkles. I realised that was a disgusting image, but anyway. And when Red Bull rolled out the RB5 for the 2009 season, it seemed that they had all they needed to challenge for the title. Almost. Brawn GP broke into the fold with the BGP 001, which Jenson Button used to win 6 out of the first 7 races, establishing a lead in the championship that he merely had to sustain rather than build on. Didn't mean for a moment, however, that Seb's year was a damp squib. Far from it. In the 3rd round in China, he won the Grand Prix from pole position, incidentally being Red Bull's first Grand Prix win, and despite some difficulties in the first few rounds, the Red Bull Vettel combo was starting to bear fruit. He won in Silverstone, and again in Suzuka, and in the final round in Abu Dhabi. But it wasn't enough, Button having harboured enough points to win the title. Despite the team ailing in development and being nowhere near their indomitable form at the beginning of the year, Vettel finished the year in 2nd place in the standings, ahead of the other Brawn of Rubens Barrichello, and more than a race win's worth of points ahead of teammate Mark Webber. It's fine, they reasoned, we'll get him next year. The build-up to 2010 was immense. Sure, Red Bull would have been confident with their formidable driver combo and equally formidable pencil of Adrian Newey, but the rest of the pack were playing their own game of top trumps. Ferrari had drafted in Fernando Alonso, McLaren had brought in reigning world champion Jenson Button, and Brawn was taken over by Mercedes, with one of its drivers being 7-time world champion Michael Schumacher, fresh out of retirement. I guess that tickled Seb a little bit, knowing that he would get to race against his hero, but his hero was still his competition, and he knew that he had a shot at becoming the world champion, primarily because, come that first round, he stuck it on pole position. A good start. But in the dying moments of the race, one of the spark plugs in the engine bay decided to lay down in protest. This slowed his car down to such an extent that the Ferrari of Alonso shot past victory, while Seb could only manage a measly 4th place. No matter though, he would start from pole position in the next race in Melbourne, although that went wrong as well. It doesn't matter how brave you are, having brakes fail you on that part of the track would cause a mass exodus of from anyone Spankter. A win in Sepang basically implied that so long as the Red Bull can hold itself together long enough to survive a race, it was good enough to win it. But that did present the other problem for Sebastian that year, his teammate, Mark Webber. This chonk-chinned Aussie had helped morph Red Bull into the team it would become, and not too many people could get the better of him in the same car. He'd already voiced his displeasure at the British Grand Prix when Seb was prioritised with newer parts, but an incident in the Turkish Grand Prix earlier that year was particularly damaging. Quite literally. Ironically, this wasn't the first time that these two had crashed, and it wouldn't be the last time that 2 Red Bulls would lock horns. But with the championship being so close back then, this was the last thing that either of them needed. Luckily, however, Seb took this incident as calmly as a man could take it.
What the f*** are we doing here? What a stupid action! I'm going home. You.
Okay, maybe he didn't, but it meant throwing away more points in the championship, this time of his own volition. Doesn't matter whose side you pick, that was totally unnecessary. You don't like that blunt assessment? Well, tough. Argue with the screen. He'd bounced back, however, with a win in Valencia, and while the McLarens of Hamilton and Button were leading the championship, Seb was right back into contention. He was racking up pole positions as the year went on, and apart from a minor whoopsie in the Belgian Grand Prix, he continued to accumulate points consistently. He took a win in the Japanese Grand Prix, but Webber was still a ways ahead in the standings. With 4 victories up to that point, he was leading the points by a decent margin, on track to become the first Aussie to win the World Championship in 30 years. He wouldn't help himself, however, when he spun out in the opening stages of the Korean Grand Prix and applied the crab mentality to Brittany. This left the door wide open for Seb to score maximum points. until his machinery failed him again, and his retirement left the damn door ajar for the Lord of the Eyebrows, who took victory, and the championship lead along with it. Seb now lay 25 points behind Fernando, a whole race win's worth of points, with 50 points on offer in the last 2 races that year. It was by no means impossible, but it wouldn't be easy either. At Interlagos, Vettel would get the whole shot over Nico Hülkenberg at the start, took the lead, and would stay there until the end. This meant that heading into the final round, the championship went down to 4 drivers: Lewis Hamilton, Mark Webber, Fernando Alonso, and Sebastian Vettel, all to be decided on the formidable, most challenging, widely popular track known as Yas Marina. Seb set the pace throughout the weekend, but in reality, it didn't really matter, because even if he won, all Fernando needed was a nice, safe 4th position, and in qualifying, he had placed 3rd. So in a basic sense, he kinda had one hand on the trophy. He just needed to hold station, and Seb was a little helpless to all of this. Off the line, he retained his lead, and he would stay there for the remainder of the race. He had done all he could possibly do, but so did Massa 2 years ago. What really mattered was what happened behind him. It was all down to where Alonso was, and where he was P7, stuck behind the Renault of Vitaly Petrov. This was thanks to some early pit stops and the ever larger issue of the Yas Marina circuit, where even illegal overtaking was tricky. The laps trickled down as the sun dipped below the horizon, and as Sebastian crossed the line at the end of lap 55 to win the race, all he could do was wait. It was all down to where Fernando finished. Formula 1 World Champion, the youngest Formula 1 World Champion, and yet it was the first time all year that he had actually led the championship, but that's when it matters most. I mean, obviously. Ever heard of a halfway through the season champion? Even after all the unreliability throughout the year, he was on the top step of the podium, king of the world. It seemed incredible, but it was only the beginning. 2011 was a mega season for Seb. In the 19 Grand Prix held that season, he got pole position in 15 of them. It was domination on a grand scale, and for the large part, he converted those poles into race wins as well. His critics may argue that his car was on rails, but whatever his car was, it cannot drive itself. It cannot just magically pull out some great drives on its own. In Monaco, after bossing the field in qualifying, he led the race comfortably, but when he came into pit, his pit crew were not there. An ongoing tradition for Red Bull in Monaco, it seems. Although, in fairness, he had lost his radio mid-race, thanks to interference from someone's microwave oven in one of the surrounding apartments. Thus, the pit stop was slow, and was set out behind Jenson Button. He was also on the wrong tyres, but he decided to turn that into a net positive. He spontaneously switched to a one-stop strategy, and would stay with his hard compound tyres for the rest of the race. He would hold off Button to take victory in what was called a champion's drive. In Italy, he took victory again, with a car that was down on speed compared to their rivals, battling hard with Alonso, and even picking up on a bit of lawn mowing to scythe through into the lead. A genuine pass in the grass, in a drive described as incredibile. Later on that year in India, Seb displayed a level of dominance that one could only marvel at. Pole position by 3/10, fastest lap, led every lap, and won the Grand Prix. With 3 rounds remaining, Seb had already sewn up the championship, becoming the youngest double world champion and steadily building his reputation as one of the greats of the sport, even after only a few years in the game. Relatively speaking, this year was a bit of a cruise for him. 2012 would be a little more challenging, because Ferrari were about to launch their secret weapon, and it wasn't their car, it was the driver. Granted, Alonso had been with the team for a couple of years now, but in 2012, he would attempt to achieve the impossible, to win the World Championship with Ferrari when it was run by the Italians. McLaren turned up with a rocket ship that year too. However, they were plagued with reliability issues and thus weren't going to be much of a factor. A smoke-stricken Lotus Renault conspired to help Seb secure second place in the opening round in Melbourne, but the next round in Malaysia hardly bore much fruit. He finished outside the points there, and in his displeasure, he took his anger out on Narain Karthikeyan, calling him an idiot and a cucumber for holding him up a tad was a little bit uncalled for. Okay, maybe entirely uncalled for. In China, he missed Q3 and finished behind his teammate in the race. The Red Bulls just unable to compete with Mercedes that weekend. Aside from that one podium in Melbourne, the first 3 races saw no pole positions, no fastest laps, and no race wins. It was a little bit strange. But then we were brought right back to reality when he grand slalom the next round in Bahrain. He took the lead of the championship, helped Red Bull back into the lead of theirs as well, and now it was a case of brilliant. So when exactly are you winning your title this year? Well, the thing is, for the next 10 rounds, he wouldn't win another race. Heading into Singapore, Seb lay in P4 in the standings, behind Kimi Raikkonen and Lewis Hamilton by 1 and 2 points respectively. But the man atop the standings was one Fernando Alonso, somehow hauling his red push bike into contention, nearly 40 points ahead with 7 rounds remaining. It was by no means wrapped up, but Seb would need to go on a tear. And and he did so. Singapore, Japan, Korea, India, he won them all. He also got 2 podiums in Abu Dhabi and Austin, and now it was advantage Vettel heading into the final round in Brazil. The Interlagos circuit always providing a treat for the final rounds. In fact, while we're at it, Abu Dhabi, nothing personal, but Interlagos should always play host to the final round of the year. It's that level of racetrack. With 13 points separating Seb from Alonso, he'd ideally just want a clean race and to bang some decent points, so that no matter what Alonso did, he could not beat Seb for the title. Rumours abound Ferrari might order Felipe Massa to run Seb off the road to help Alonso win the title. These rumours were squashed though, and rightly so. When the race started on Sunday afternoon, of course, neither Ferrari would attempt to take him out. They wouldn't need to, because the Williams of Bruno Senna decided to get friendly with his right rear tyre. This was a disaster. I mean, obviously, spun to the back of the field with what one can argue was his own mess. He had a lot of catching up to do, and none of this was helped by the fact that Alonso had now scythed through into 3rd place. As things stood now, Fernando Alonso would be the world champion. Of course, the whole year where Seb had applied his trade and proven his worth, it would have been dim to assume that he would not have had a chance at points. He climbed through the field and into the points within a matter of laps. Damage from the lap 1 gymnastics were not helping, and incoming rain threatened to curtail his efforts. But Alonso wasn't faring much better either. After initially stopping, the rain decided to come back again. Vettel went to pit for intermediates, but when he arrived, his team weren't there. They didn't know he was coming, the radio having failed again, thus delaying him again, and Alonso was now up to 2nd place. The conditions by now were a little bit tricky, and the race was tumultuous, as was evidenced when Paul di Resta littered the track with bits of what used to be his Force India. The safety car came out, and the race would finish in that order. Alonso finished 2nd with 18 points in hand, which meant that Seb would have had to have finished 7th or better. He crossed the line in P6. 3-time World Drivers Champion, and only the 3rd driver in history to win the world title 3 times in a row. The other 2 being Juan Manuel Fangio and Michael Schumacher. He was already cementing his place amongst the greats, but if anyone thought that these last 3 title campaigns were impressive, oh boy, next year was something else. Seb would win 13 out of 19 races that year, most notably winning the last 9 races in a row, and oh boy, I remember them days. Staying up till 3 AM here in New Zealand on a school night to watch Seb walk away into the distance in what seemed like a guaranteed win every freaking time. The campaign was so comprehensive that after crossing the line to win the Indian Grand Prix, he became a 4-time world champion. These iconic shots symbolize the dominance of this era. Car or not, this was supreme driving. It wasn't so much his outright pace, which was there, but it was the way that he controlled the races. I mean, just watch the likes of Singapore and India. After watching Seb streak into turn 1, the whole field in unison proclaimed,
"Oh shit, here we go again."
Vettel was in the record books, and an established great. Yeah, even at this stage. But as we know, being dominant in this game is a double-edged sword, and Seb was no exception. You see, despite him being a right laugh from the very beginning, and someone you'd really have no legitimate reason to hate, fan perception of this guy had become frosty. Like, quite frosty. Round 2 of the championship was in Malaysia. Vettel took pole position by a million miles and led the race in the opening stages. After the first round of pit stops, however, he was behind teammate Webber, and he was not too pleased about this. Too slow, he reckoned, too slow. A second round of pit stops later, and again, Vettel was stuck behind Aussie Grit. They squabbled over position, providing some truly fantastic racing, but the Red Bull pit wall wouldn't be having any of that nonsense. So, the call went out to Seb. Set map Multi 2-1, or as would become known simply as Multi 21. The basic gist of it being, keep your mouth shut and stay in line until the end of the race. Do not pass Webber, and no fighting.
No f***ing fighting!
Seb didn't care though. To him, this wasn't racing, he wanted to race. And so, with Webber being told that Seb would stay behind him, he looked behind to see that he wasn't there anymore. He was now alongside him, passing him for the lead, against team orders. Webber tried in vain to get back past him, but it was no use. Seb went on through to win the race, and to say that Webber was pissed would be a bit like saying that Abu Dhabi was a bit of a whoopsie-doo. Vettel initially apologised, but would then rescind it, saying that while he does respect team decisions, probably Mark is not the one who deserved to win at the time. The bottom line is, he was racing, he was faster, he passed him, he won. I mean, yeah, it might sound a little arrogant, but Was he 1,000,000% wrong? You know, just asking. Lawyers threatened to intervene if Red Bull decided to punish him for going rogue, and the coverage of this did not go unnoticed. At several points during the year, he was booed, whether that be down to Multi-21 or just the dominance in general. The reality was that he had the popularity of that one kid in class who reminded the teacher that they had homework due that day. I hate you! Not that Seb would have seen much of the social media dumpster fire and the comments that lay within it. After all, he was a man who had rejected social media for as long as it existed. He had no Facebook, he had no Twitter, he had no Instagram, he had nothing. But hey, could you really blame him? I mean, at the time, he was just not a popular dude. A lot of people were already sick of his domination and just wanted it all to end. And next year, they got their wish. One had to be forgiven for thinking that Red Bull were the favourites heading into the season. I mean, after all, they had the best car for the last few years. But the RB10 wasn't much coy, and more importantly, Mercedes had caught up. From having 9 pole positions and 13 wins the previous season, Seb's total in 2014 was nothing. For the first time since 2007, he went winless in a Formula 1 season. Reliability was poor throughout that year, but the biggest headache for Seb was the emergence of the Honey Badger. While Seb went winless, Daniel Ricciardo won 3 times. He was also out-qualified over the season, and on paper, that did not look great on Seb, even if the fight wasn't as one-sided as it seemed on the surface. Whatever the reasons were for the downfall, it seemed like vindication for those who thought that he was only winning because of his car, but a change of scenery was afoot for 2015. He would no longer be a Red Bull driver. Instead, he was bound for Italia. He would be joining Ferrari, replacing Alonso and joining Kimi Raikkonen and Maranello. Again, Mercedes had come to play that season. They were the creme de la creme, and their 2 drivers were on top of their game. Most of the time. But in Malaysia, Seb would take the fight to both Lewis and Nico, and he would beat them both, taking his first win in over a year, and his first with the Scuderia. It was, after all, something he had dreamed of, emulating his hero, who had won with Ferrari before he had ever plonked his keister into a racing car. It also seemed to register a return to form. A brilliant race through tyre management and determination brought about that annoying, yet endearing celebration on the radio, and the return of their other iconic celebration in Parc Ferme. Mercedes were the team of the year, but Seb still kept fans' hopes alive that maybe someone could stop them that year. Well, he couldn't quite pull it off, but he would win again in Hungary and in Singapore. And although he could not beat the Silver Arrows, he was miles ahead of Kimi in the standings. He declared the season a miracle. And maybe it was. This led to hope of a challenge for the title come 2016. Well, that didn't happen either. Ferrari let the Italians design the car, he was constantly hounded by Russian torpedoes, and thus went without a win that season too. There wasn't a hell of a lot wrong with 2016, but there wasn't much to write home about either. Red Bull had developed a better car that season, and Mercedes, well, we know what Mercedes does. Ferrari needed to deliver these guys a car. A good one. In 2017, Ferrari came out with the SF70H. Was this car good enough? Well, let me put it to you this way. After crossing the line to win the 2017 Monaco Grand Prix, the championship situation was thus. Sebastian Vettel was leading the World Championship. The seemingly indomitable Mercedes were dominable after all. Vettel had won the Australian and Bahrain Grand Prix previously and took second in the other 3 races. Apart from the consistency, being up the pointy like that is what wins championships. You don't have to win everything, but everything must seem like a win. It appeared that they had what was needed to win this title. But we know what Mercedes are like. They just find pace. They are the masters of that, and they did it again. They bridged the gap, and Seb's lead in the championship began to whittle away. He won again in Hungary, despite his steering performing bewitchment mid-race, but Mercedes being Mercedes and Lewis being Lewis, the championship lead was taken away by Monza. There was another win in Brazil, but Merck's pace, along with Ferrari's reliability, meant that Seb missed out on the championship again, finishing runner-up to Lewis again. It was gutting, but one had to be honest. There were some self-inflicted wounds that season, such as ramming into Lewis in Baku, whacking Sir Lancelot after the race in Malaysia, and setting off a chain reaction in Singapore that saw half the grid melt by the first corner. These incidents on their own didn't lose him the championship, but to win a championship, you need everything going for you. 2018 had to be better, and when he won the first 2 rounds in Malaysia and Bahrain, one couldn't complain. But in China, Verstappen punted him out of a podium position, and one could complain about that. In Baku, a potential win went begging as he took the magic route late in the race, and in Spain, the Mercs were untouchable. A podium in Monaco followed by a win in Montreal, however, brought him back in the game. Win number 50 for him, and a sniff at the top of the standings. The championship battle was seesawing for a while. Some boneheaded moves, coupled with the win in Silverstone, meant that heading into his home Grand Prix at Hockenheim, he was leading the championship. Pole position was good. His main championship rival, starting from P14, was very good. Leading the race with Raikkonen acting as rear gunner. Excellent. It was all going to plan. But when he crashed out of the race, after leading on lap 51, it was nothing short of disastrous. Sure, retirements happen in this game, I mean, that's racing. But as many have pointed out, Seb never really recovered from this incident, knowing that he had thrown a race win away. Not just that, but had handed it to his title rival, and begun a swing of momentum toward Mercedes. Hamilton won 5 out of the next 6 races, and the title battle was wrapped up by Mexico. A second real shot at the title with Ferrari. Gone, shattered, in pieces, on the floor. Some pointed toward Ferrari's upgrade packages working a treat up until they put them on the car, but more besides pointed towards Seb's mistakes. And if one had to be honest, they were there. There was some initial promise heading into 2019. Strong preseason testing gave fans hope that perhaps it was third time lucky. Well, it didn't quite pan out that way. Mercedes once again coming to the floor, and Ferrari not quite having the package to cope. At least, not consistently. Or legally. Not that Seb didn't have his moments. He picked up another win on the streets of Singapore, even if it did come at the expense of his new teammate, Charles Leclerc, who had proven to be a real headache for him that year. The young Monegasque proving his pace, and actually finishing ahead of him in the standings. But apart from that, there were some other things that season that he really did not need. The engine fiasco at Ferrari was one of them for sure, but the events of the Canadian Grand Prix too were a real kick in the teeth. The stewards effectively taking away his victory as consequence of his mid-race lawn mowing. There was also the disaster class at Monza, while his teammate romped home to a famous win. And there was also the momentous collision in Brazil, a meltdown too spectacular even by Ferrari standards. Those struggles, however, were nothing, not compared to 2020. The year was the 40th anniversary of the 1980 season, and thus turned up with a car equally as as the one they had that year. Neither Seb nor Charles could wring much of a result out of it, with Seb's highlight of the year being a podium placing at the Turkish Grand Prix. The rest of the year, however, well, that was a goddamn nightmare. And it wasn't really made much better by the announcement at the start of the season that he would be out of Ferrari come season's end. It was a hammer blow and a sad way to end his stint at Ferrari, something that initially brought about so much promise, ending on a whimper. Where exactly he would end up was anyone's guess. Perhaps even into retirement. Well, in September, rumours abound that Lawrence Stroll was looking to bolster his squad come 2021, when he would rebrand Racing Point to Aston Martin and attempt to take the team to the top of the world. And realising the coup at play here, Stroll signed Seb to the team for 2021. The team were not creme de la creme at the time, but they were a team known for extracting the most out of the resources that they had, a la 1300 quid and whatever they can kick out of the Coke machine. Things weren't overly brilliant at the start, if one had to be honest. Again, we had to ask, were these the mistakes of someone who perhaps didn't have it in him anymore? I mean, if I'm being honest, I thought that at the time, that maybe this wasn't Seb anymore. At least, not the one we know. Well, come round 5, he shut us all up. In Monaco, the pace of the Aston Martins just completely sprung from nowhere, and Seb used these narrow streets to his advantage, holding off 7-time reigning world champion Sir Lewis Hamilton to take P5 that weekend. And at the next round in Baku, he navigated through the late race carnage to take second place. Aston Martin's first podium in Formula 1 ever, at least under that moniker. This really did seem like the great story many thought destined to be. Vettel en route to redemption, and Aston breaking through as a real powerhouse in the Formula 1 World Championship. Well, the pace never really remained thereafter, and they began to fade back into relative midfield obscurity for the remainder of that year, save only for the one fine performance in Hungary, where he battled Esteban Ocon for victory. He finished the race second for about 15 minutes, after which time the stewards disqualified him after 0.00001 millimeter of fuel evaporated in Parc Ferme. That was below the limit, and thus he was DQ'd. He finished that year in 12th, ahead of his teammate. Although, depending upon who you ask, that's hardly a mean feat. Still, with the prospectively massive investment from Big Daddy, the future did seem bright. 2022 could have been that year, but then they rocked up with the car they would actually race that season. The AMR 22, look, to put it bluntly, it was and Seb missing out on the first 2 rounds that year did not help toward his understanding of the car. By the time he got back into the car in Melbourne, however, he found out what it wanted to do. Yes, it wanted to put him into the wall. Aston's hopeless attempt at innovation did not prevent Seb from putting in some awesome performances that year. Aside from the rusty start, this was the Seb that we knew and loved, that can make a car work and work well. But then, on July 28th, he did the one thing that he had long shied away from. He created an Instagram account. Seemed innocent enough at the time, but for someone who vehemently rejected the ideology of social media, this had to have been for something. Soon after the account was created, he posted,
I hereby announce my retirement from Formula One by the end of the 2022 season.
It's something we all saw coming perhaps, but for those of us who have been fans for any length of time, or who had watched this guy rise through the ranks to establish himself as a great of the sport, it was still a sucker punch. Come season's end, Sebastian Vettel would no longer be on that Formula One grid. It seemed almost incomprehensible. Of course, there was still a race to be run, in both respects. We'll get into each, but the first and perhaps more obvious one, he still had half a season left to complete, and he made damn sure that despite being in an Aston, he was gonna remind people of who he was. For the vast majority of the remaining rounds, Seb hustled his car into the points. Some spectacular drives led to multiple Driver of the Day awards. Some, admittedly, out of nostalgia and sympathy, but in races like Suzuka and Austin, he had proven that he was and always will be a racer. A damn fine one at that. His final Grand Prix start came in Abu Dhabi, the site of his first world title back in 2010. He got the Guard of Honor, he got the points finish, he got the donut celebration, torturing the power unit and the Pirelli rubber, all of which he so utterly deserved. And that was it. Bringing down the curtain on a career that began back in 2007, winning with midfield cars, dominating the championship in the early 2010s, bringing hope to teams such as Ferrari and Aston Martin, all that being the stuff on the track. Off the track was something else entirely. We've already mentioned how back in 2013, he was not a popular dude. The sight of him on the podium often drew out boos. People were sick of his domination, and I know this because I was one of those assholes. And he had a tough nuts that's racing personality about him. But since that time, he performed a complete 180 and became one of the most beloved people on that grid. His journey through Formula One was incredible for a number of reasons, but now it's time for him to start his next race. The one of the future. Our future. The future of the human race. There's just one thing. In that announcement, he made mention that the marks he left on track will remain until time and rain will wash them away. I'm not sure this is in the right context, but if he was referring to his time in Formula One, the thing is this: when you have a career like he did, that's not something that just goes away. The youngest pole position winner, most consecutive wins in a season, most pole positions in a season, 57 pole positions, 38 fastest laps, 122 podiums, 53 Grand Prix wins, 4 World Drivers' Championships, and to this day remains the youngest World Drivers' Champion. Those marks are eternal. They'll never erode. We'll never forget them. We will never forget Sebastian Vettel.